Welcome to the Nebraska Soybean Board Weekly Market Roundup, being brought to you by Nebraska Soybean Farmers and their checkoff. I'm Susan Littlefield. It is going to come as no surprise. A big chunk of what we are going to talk about this week has been this ProFarmer Tour and what the numbers see, and a breakdown from both the gentlemen that are going to join us. Stick around. More is coming up right after this.
Meet the champions of innovation in the heart of Nebraska. They're not just farmers, and they nurture more than just crops, pushing boundaries and turning challenges into opportunities. They trade knowledge and know-how, and their dedication doesn't end at harvest. It's in your every bite and every drive. The future of food, fuel, and fiber, and the future of Nebraska starts right here.
And welcome back once again. Joining us today is Darren Frye with Water Street Solutions and Jeff Peterson over at Heartland Farm Partners. I'm at the Nebraska State Fair, which is underway through Labor Day in Grand Island. And gentlemen, you just joked before we even started this program. You guys were having an amazing discussion, and I do kind of wish I'd have been recording already. But let's do a breakdown. And Jeff, I want to start with you. What was your biggest surprise as you saw those ProFarmer numbers come out?
So as I dug in and took a look at them, the soybean number actually was probably my biggest surprise on the yield side there. And, that came in at 54.9. That's 1.7 bushels the acre higher than what the August WASDE report would have been. And that way, as we go back and look, we go back through and look back to all the way to 2011. And that would be higher than really what we've ever came in against the August. The previous was about 1.4 bushels higher. But as we dig into that, I guess it should be no surprise that the pod counts were really big. And now we'll have to see. What we know is that basically this report is going to count pods over a 1/4 inch long. So as a result of that, we know there's a lot of potential out there. So we're going to have to watch very closely to see whether or not we can physically get the moisture in the fill. Now, it appears that we should have that. The other thing that I was looking for that I was glad to see, I guess, because we want with these prices, want a crop that's big enough to at least these guys have a chance to try to make some revenue and try to cover some of the costs anyway. It won't cover it all. Is at the ear counts, and the ear counts actually for the most part came in pretty good. We were a little concerned, and we know there was going to be problems up in South Dakota. We knew it was going to probably show up, or not in South Dakota. Well, South Dakota and also Minnesota, southeast South Dakota. We also knew it'd probably show up in District 1 in northwest corner of Iowa, just because of the planting conditions up there. But we were looking to see, were they able to get the stands established? And overall, it appeared that it came in okay, Susan.
All right, for you, Darren, what was your biggest takeaway from those numbers?
Well, I agree with Jeff. The bean number was large, but kind of thought that all week, just because as you watch them count pods in every state, they were above pretty much their record counts, and so they continue to be well above. And so just because you got a lot of pods doesn't mean you'll have more yield in every single case, but in most cases it does. You don't know how many of those were 2 or 3 or 4 bean pods or any of that. You don't know how many will finish out, but there's no question it's a big yield coming. Is it 53, 54, 55? Finishing weather will have a say to that. And I think for the most part, like Jeff said, finishing weather will be pretty decent. There are a few places around the country that probably will run thin on moisture, and that'll cut back maybe some of that yield, but pretty good yield coming for soybeans. Corn didn't surprise me. It was a little bit less. In fact, some of the data that I saw as the week progressed, I thought it might be even 180 or a little bit under, given some of the sporadic corn results when they got into even places like South Dakota, Minnesota, even parts of Illinois and northern Indiana were difficult to get record yield. So I was kind of surprised that maybe it was as high as it was, but we'll see what happens here in the end.
So do we expect, as you look at these numbers that are coming in and compiled, obviously the market's going to get a chance to digest them over the weekend, but do we expect any surprises that could come when we look at the September WASDE report and they do the comparison of what we saw August WASDE to September WASDE and then smashed in the middle ProFarmer? Darren, I'll start with you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. ProFarmer doesn't tour everywhere, and obviously the September WASDE will be more accurate. I'm not saying it will be different from the ProFarmer Tour, but they do cover more geographic area, and they're going to go in the field. They're going to inspect what's going on, like ProFarmer did. And that crop that's mature, in corn, they'll weigh it. The stuff that isn't mature, they'll estimate, no different than what a ProFarmer Tour would do. And we'll have a better idea of the direction of this trend. Is it going to increase from the August WASDE, or they're going to leave it the same? If they leave it the same, there's a good case could be made that maybe we have a crop that's about right sized. If they increase it, chances are it'll probably even get bigger as we move into October, November, in my opinion.
What about for you, Jeff? I saw you kind of shaking your head in agreement as Darren was talking.
Yeah, there's a lot of points of agreement there, definitely is. Because as we look at that, we think about that September report. And so NASA is going to be doing, that report come up the yield just like what they did, on the yield side back in August. But we do have an important change, and Darren pointed that out. They will physically get out there and set up those plots. We used to see that happen in August, but ever since 2019, they switched that. So I think that's where we were able to get an idea of what the stand counts and ear counts were looking like coming at from the ProFarmer side. The thing we know, though, about the ProFarmer, there's a lot of great things about it. One of the challenges with it is as you run the numbers and how they come up with the yield, they're counting off the ears, they measure off the length of the kernels, they count the rows, you multiply that all together and divide by your row width as we're talking about corn. So really, if you think about it, we're talking about linear inches, and we're converting that back to yield. Doesn't take into anything in regard to the fill. So basically how deep are the kernels, how good is the fill? And that's a thing we'll get a chance to see, I think, in the September report. Now, anecdotally, as we look at it, we say, okay, what do we think the fill is going to be like? Well, we go back and we look and we say, well, what was July weather like? Well, July weather, for the most part, in most areas, actually on the temp side, probably about right on temp and actually really good on precip. Then we look at, well, what are the first few days of August coming along? And really, it's a lot of the same. So one thing that we're going to have to watch, though, is that the GDUs are okay, except for probably North Dakota, South Dakota, parts of Minnesota. But if we look at the hours of sunlight, there's a few problems popping up there. We're seeing that across North Dakota, South Dakota. Is it enough to physically go ahead and cause just more of a delay in how long, basically, when harvest starts? Or is it also going to come back to the photosynthetic activity enough in regard to the ability to get a good heavy test weight? So we're going to have to watch that. Over on the bean side, we know that with the amount of beans that are out there, as we've mentioned before, it's going to really make sure we have good fill. But as they run those numbers from USDA, I think actually it'll lean towards a number, whether it's half or 3/4 of a bushel as we come into soybeans. And I do think, and I wouldn't have thought this till I dug a little deeper in the numbers, I think it could suggest that we could even have a little bit higher number on the corn side, but it's really going to depend upon how those kernels fill out.
So, Darren, you're in the Eastern Corn Belt. Kind of give us a view of what you're seeing crop-wise for them.
Our crop's excellent over here. I'm not sure we have a 225 in Illinois, but I would be surprised if we're not a new record. But 225 is a lot to get, especially northern areas of Illinois aren't quite as good. There's been some wind damage with that derecho that came through. And so I'd just be surprised if we get a 225. 215 to 220 certainly possible. Indiana is really good. I'm hearing quite a bit of tar spot pressure in southern Indiana. So we'll have to see how that shakes out. But the Eastern Corn Belt as a whole is in real good shape.
And I know too, Jeff, you kind of alluded to it when we first started talking. You were breaking down those numbers. It comes as no surprise that the struggle has been there for parts of South Dakota, Minnesota, and even that northern part of Iowa.
Yeah, you're exactly right. It sure does. And I'd say the two results did show that. And the thing that did surprise me a little bit, and I'm glad that Darren brought up, some of those parts of Illinois, is as good as the crop does sound out there. I was a little surprised as I was watching that eastern leg to just hear that it just wasn't quite as consistent. Now, we were wondering if that would be the case because we knew there were some issues early on with getting that crop in, and then a little dryness for a while, and then it kind of came back around again. So that's going to be interesting to see. To get these kind of numbers, we are going to have some pretty consistent crops across the whole corn belt. But I do think one good point and thing that Darren brought up early is that the areas outside of where they sample, those fringe areas, that those are very, very important. And I don't mean to say fringe to in any way make it that they're less important, but in those areas outside the major corn producing areas, those are going to be important. Now this year, some years they help us, but this year they're probably going to be a little bit of drag on us. And
is it easy to kind of have those blinders on per se and say, well, darn it, I've been hailed out. the rest of the world should be as bad as I am.
Yeah, I would say that's true. You know, there's a lot of variation out here when you think of the hail and the wind that went through early, and that area in Nebraska, there's probably 400,000 acres that just about got all but destroyed. And so when you look at that, you think, how could other people have such a great yield? So it's kind of like when you're in a rainstorm and you're traveling along, you think it's raining everywhere, but maybe it's just following you along and it's not raining hardly any other places. So we got to get outside of our area and look around, and the best way to do that is to travel or to fly over. And I think overall it's a pretty solid crop. But like Jeff said, the fringe areas, or there's areas outside of the 3 I states, Nebraska, Minnesota, are going to have to carry their weight this year to end up with this big yield.
Well, as we wrap up today's program, gentlemen, I want to ask each one of you, and Jeff, I'll start with you. Marketing plans. What do you see? Should we be doing some changing, rethinking as we move towards fall harvest?
Well, here's the big thing. I think at this time of year, especially as we're getting a chance, step one, get out in those fields, understand what you've got for a yield, think about what you've got for storage, really sit down and go through your cash flow needs very closely and know where you're going to need the cash. Then from there, really dig in and look and say, okay, what do I got sold? Do I have enough sold? Do I not have enough sold? Think about the amount you're going to have to move to town. Now, if you've got bushels sold ahead, then, and they're done on, say, like a no basis established or hedge to arrive, then we have to physically focus on the spread. I don't think we're quite ready to roll those contracts yet for those bushels you're going to have in your bin. Then the other thing we got to do is watch the basis. And here's where there's going to be some big differences: Eastern Corn Belt versus Western Corn Belt, and in and around the river. Here in the western part of the Corn Belt, what we want to do is we want to watch our basis levels on our nearby very close. We've still got better basis on the nearby versus the harvest. As long as we physically have a better basis on the nearby versus what our harvest is, we don't need to do anything with the basis yet. But there are some areas as you get out and approach the river, the Mississippi, and Darren, you might have some areas out in your area too with some big crops and a lot of bushels maybe that were left over, that, you know, there may need to be already some work done on getting basis set. But here in the western part of the Corn Belt, we're just going to hold tight for a little bit yet, Susan.
All right, Darren, for you, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I piggyback off that. I think the basis is going to be a real issue in the east because there's still old crop out here. There's a big new crop coming, and I don't think a lot of it's priced. And so I just don't see basis being near as strong as it would be in a normal year. So getting basis set for fall bushels have to move, I think, is smart. As far as fall bushels, moving them, a lot of people want to put them on a basis contract. That doesn't work very well, and it doesn't work at all when you have a carry market, and the carry could increase. We know when we roll that forward, they take it off our basis, so our basis continues to worsen. I really like just moving the fall corn and looking to reown it on paper at a later date once we get through the glut, or the majority of harvest, and we can start moving toward a South American crop. We might get a rally then, and we can afford to reown at that point.
All right. Well, gentlemen, thank you both for joining us for this weekend's report. A very quick reminder, commodity futures and options do involve a substantial risk of loss, not suitable to all investors. From the Nebraska State Fair, this is the Nebraska Soybean Board Weekly Market Roundup.